Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in to the Dallas County Democratic Party's Town Hall Series. Today we have a very esteemed panel, especially with everything that's been going on today. What I want to do first is talk a little bit about the panel that we have. We have Mr. David Johnson. Mr. David Johnson has been a drum major for justice in the area. He is a prominent civil rights leader whose history of activism in the Dallas spans over 4 decades. He was born in 1955 and he grew up in Louisiana, where his father led the local branch of the NAACP. Johnson's attributes his early activism to his family's influence and his involvement with the first encountered Pan-Africanism during his studies at Southern University, a historically Black university in Baton Rouge as a young man. Johnson also served as the president of the NAACP youth chapter and participated in the local city movement. So he's definitely been on the forefront of the social justice movement for a very long time, and we're very honored and to have him on the panel today. We also have David Henderson. David Henderson is a seasoned trial lawyer who joined a law firm to fight for justice, and he's been fighting for justice ever since he's been here in Dallas County. David earned his BA in Plan 2 honors and his law degree from the University of Texas. Afterwards, he joined the litigation section of one of Texas's largest law firms. Through that, David enjoyed the intellectual challenges of complex litigation. He wanted to try cases, so he joined the Special Crimes Division of the District Attorney's Office. David has tried over 70 jury trials to a verdict ranging from civil cases to human trafficking to capital murder. So he's done a lot of the gamuts, like I said, in the court systems. So we are very honored and pleasure to have him as a speaker on the panel today. And our moderator is Justice Erin Nowell. She was elected to the 5th District Court of Appeals in 2018. Justice Nowell is no stranger to prosecuting claims and defending lawsuits, having spent time on both sides of the courtroom. She began her career at a nationally recognized plaintiff special firms specializing in toxic tort litigation, where the skills to manage and litigate large-scale mass torts. So she's, like I said, we're definitely honored and pleasure to have her as the moderator for this panel. So what I want to do is to thank our sponsors. We would like to thank Tillerson Law, also the Honorable Carol and Dan Donovan, the Honorable Terry Barker, Dr. Canalita Garcia, Hamilton Wingo LLP, the Honorable Marcy Helfand and Robert Book, and also Scott Perez LLP. We would like to thank our sponsors, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to have these town hall series. So I introduce to some and present to others, Judge Erin Nowell.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad we have actually a really good group today. I am super excited to be here with Reverend Peter Johnson and David Henderson to talk about, honestly, the Black Lives Matter movement, and hopefully to get some advice from these wonderful gentlemen about how we as a community and as a country proceed during this time of civil unrest. So I'm going to start with Reverend Johnson, who I know has a history of being a stalwart in our civil rights movement. And I want to ask you, are civil rights supposed to apply to everyone?
Absolutely. First, let me thank everybody for this unique opportunity, and also to share with those that don't know, we lost Charles Everett earlier today, the brother of Magda Everett. So this last 2 months, we've lost Joseph Lowry, C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, not Charles Everett. Looking at a picture that Don brought me earlier that has Fred Service with Andy Young, C.T. Vivian, and Joseph Lowry. This is a picture taken under the sign that says Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Church, Andy is the only one left alive. So as we deal with yesterday, looking to tomorrow, we need to be wise enough and sensitive enough to pay tribute to those who have left this earth, who paid such a tremendous sacrifice for us to be able to enjoy not having to see colored and white signs, and to check into the Holiday Inn wherever our money, or buy a home wherever our money will allow us to buy it. So thank you all for this opportunity, and Judge, it's good to see you, precious.
Thank you. And Mr. Johnson, I know that we were having some mic issues earlier. A few people are saying they're having a hard time hearing you. So if you could turn your mic up as high as possible, that'd be great.
Okay, and then when I was being introduced, he introduced me as being David Johnson. My name is Basil Peter Johnson. You can call me Basil if you can speak Creole and make gumbo.
I can do neither, and so I'm going to call you Reverend because I know that's right.
Can you all hear me clearly now?
That's definitely a much better.
Thank you.
So, David, obviously we're living in, some people say a moment, some people say a movement. What is it that you hope that our country can learn from this moment or this movement?
I'm not hoping for our country to learn things so much as I'm hoping for it to change things. I think that we spent a lot of time talking and trying to understand each other better. My wife and I were joking about the fact that if we get one more friendly call from one of our friends who is white, acknowledging that they didn't completely understand what we're going through, we're going to scream, unless it also leads to some lasting change. And I say that because the sentiment that's going on in the country is great. I'm glad that America is finally getting a better awareness of the types of discrimination that Black and brown people face, especially when it comes to dealing with the police. But what this needs to translate into is lasting change that prevents some of these systemic problems from continuing. And one of the things I find myself thinking as a civil rights lawyer is I've been going back and refreshing my understanding of the history that led us up to this point, especially when we've lost key historic figures like John Lewis. And those lunch counter sit-ins lasted for over a year. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for over a year. And so we are still at the very early stages of pushing towards meaningful change. So what I really hope for this moment is that we all hunker down and continue between this administration and the upcoming election and the type of momentum that's going to be necessary to enact some of these changes that will influence the way policing is handled in this country. We still got miles to go before we sleep.
Understood. And actually, when we're talking about this movement and this moment, I have a really tough question for both of you that we actually even talked about offline is a really tough question, but I think it may have been the turning point for this portion of the movement, and that is the murder of George Floyd. I can't even say his name. It's painful, but talk to us, Reverend Johnson, about, especially given your past, what it felt like. What were your thoughts and feelings when viewing that horrific footage of George Floyd's murder?
Quote from one of the movies, a very famous quote, "Another man done gone." And for me, too many of our men have been buried because of the—
Reverend Johnson, we're still having a hard time hearing you. I think it was a little better without the headphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Is that better?
Yes.
But one of the great quotes that I remember about one of the movies, historical movies, is "Another man done gone." To have to continue to bury our men from the ongoing brutality and murder of our people lets us know that everything has changed, yet nothing has changed, because we're still dealing with daily police brutality, daily police viciousness toward people of color. The only thing that's changed today is technology. We've got telephones that can take pictures. The treatment of our people, especially our men, by America's police force, is a historic problem. We can not have to prove it today because telephones can take pictures. So it's hard to say that they aren't murdering our people because a picture don't lie. But for me, the question is this going to ever change? Are we going to ever feel? I have 2 grandsons and a son. Will I go to my grave worrying about the safety of my grandsons regarding the color of their skin and how it may affect their ability to live in America because of police brutality and the killing of our children? I can't hear anybody.
No, I was giving that was a moment. I think we needed a moment because that is the question right now. And David, I'm going to turn to you and ask the same question, but also add, what is it, aside from the technology and it being seen, what is it do you think about this moment, this murder that started the movement that we're seeing right now, the response that we're seeing right now?
I think it's 2 things that started the response that we're seeing right now. One of them is the fact that this is coming on the back of several unjustifiable murders that we've seen of unarmed Black men and people of color. Also, I think that what was unique about this video, at least for me, was this was the first time I actually saw one of these videos at the same time that my wife was also seeing it for the first time. My wife is a doctor, and she has different thoughts when we see these videos of police killings. I'm always thinking about it from a legal point of view, but she asks something very obvious that I tend not to think about, and she always asks, why aren't they attempting to render aid? Like when we saw the Eric Garner video, that was the first thing she asked when he collapsed to the ground. He started saying, I can't breathe. She said, why aren't they rendering aid? Some of these people can be saved if they would simply try. I think what really stood out about George Floyd's video was they had him secured on the ground, face down, hands behind his back. He was not putting up a fight. And then you have bystanders who are urging officers standing by, hey, please take a look at him. I don't think he can breathe. I think you have him in a dangerous position. And once they received those warnings, they still didn't acknowledge them and stop what they were doing. I think when you combine the momentum that had already developed with the callousness that you see in that video, it was finally the straw that broke the camel's back. And I compare it to the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam. I don't know if anyone here has watched that. I watch all the Ken Burns documentaries. He said the difference between World War II and Vietnam was Americans seeing some of the atrocities on video, and that's what led to a lot of the social unrest. And so I'll echo what Reverend Johnson said with respect to the fact that catching these events on video, I think that it was a turning point. I also want to acknowledge, though, there were some uniquely offensive things about the George Floyd murder.
Oh, you can go further.
You want me to talk more about the legalities of it? What did you want to hear, Judge?
You say there were some uniquely offensive things. Do you want to talk about those specifically, or?
I do. I think a lot of them are being glossed over in the discussions about the protest and what they should lead to. We've started hinting at them, but I worry that the public doesn't completely understand all the ramifications. We've started this discussion, for example, of qualified immunity, but I don't think it's clear exactly how that plays out in these types of cases, because here's the question. What type of justice can George Floyd, or better yet, George Floyd's family receive at this point? And
I'm going to interrupt you, David, because we don't have all lawyers on this call. We have a lot of people. And I think that's one of the questions I was going to get to when we got into the more legal discussion is, can you define qualified immunity? Can you tell people what that is and how it affects these types of cases?
Absolutely. Qualified immunity, and I'm going to give it in lawyer talk, and then I'm going to break it down in plain speech. And I'm doing the plain speech for me. So that's not to disrespect anybody on the call. Lawyers tend to make things more complicated than they need to be. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that prevents the police from being held accountable in court, in civil court. And let me start with why I'm specifying civil court, and that's because if you commit certain types of offenses, you're going to have a case in criminal court, and you're also going to have a case in civil court. Let's give an easy example. Let's say that you have somebody who has a drinking problem who drives and delivers for Amazon. And I've actually had cases like this that I've worked on before. If they have too much to drink and they drive that Amazon van and they get into a crash, they're going to be charged with a crime, driving while intoxicated. That driver is also going to be sued in civil court, and Amazon is going to be sued in civil court. So let's apply that to a case like the George Floyd murder. The officers have been charged criminally, which is new, by the way, and Chauvin was charged with murder. And there's a debate about what types of charges should be leveled against all the other officers that were involved. I think we should come back to that because it's an important point about how police officers are treated differently than everyone else when they're accused of a crime. But moving aside from the criminal case, those police officers will probably also be sued in civil court, and the police department will be sued in civil court. Both the police officers and the police department can claim that they should not allowed to be sued at all. The officers will claim that they shouldn't be sued because of a legal doctrine called qualified immunity. And I know that's an earful, but bear with me because there's some other important points that I think you should know. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine. And the reason I say it's a doctrine is because if you read the entire Constitution, there's no mention of qualified immunity in it. You could read every single federal law. There is no mention of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a rule that the Supreme Court made up. The reason that's a big deal is because the people that are trying to protect the doctrine of qualified immunity, which are Republicans, normally argue that the courts should not be allowed to make up rules. They call that being an activist judge, and they bring it up every single time someone is nominated to the Supreme Court. But in this situation, because they want to protect police officers, they think that that doctrine should remain in place. You want me to keep going, Judge? I know that's a lot of information.
That's a lot of information. So I'm gonna take a step back from that because a lot of people have heard about qualified immunity in this particular case. Mm-hmm. But if we have a problem with this doctrine, if it's an issue that's a judge-made doctrine, as you're saying, what can we do to change that? What needs to happen?
Two things could happen. One, the Supreme Court could take the issue up again. They've had multiple opportunities recently to do it. And by the way, the most conservative judge on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, actually believes the court needs to revisit qualified immunity. The Supreme Court doesn't like to weigh in on political discussions, so they dodged the bullet this last term. They're probably going to keep dodging the bullet. And so it's really up to Congress to make progress here. And so it's important that the House has already put forward a crime reform bill that seeks to eliminate qualified immunity. The problem is with it getting stalled in the Senate. But even if it gets through both houses of Congress, this president would never sign it. So voting is important. And I also think that staying out in the streets, demonstrating, and keeping this issue in the nation's conscience is critically important. This is going to be a long, hard fight, but I cannot stress enough that if we have any type of police reform without an elimination of the doctrine of qualified immunity, and another doctrine we haven't talked about, which is how we assess wrongful conduct by the police in the criminal context, if we don't change those things, we cannot make progress on this issue.
With that in mind, you're talking about the protesting and the type of civil unrest that we're seeing. Reverend Johnson, can you talk to us a little bit about if we can change these protests into policy, if there's a way that we can make the protests become policy? Again, I know that you have a history of work in the civil rights, and you still seem obviously concerned about your children and your grandchildren. What can we do to make these protests become policy?
Ed, you promise not to ask hard questions.
I promise no such thing.
But let me see, can I make sense out of this and tie it into what Attorney David Henderson talked about, what you call it, disimmunity. It's legalized immunity. qualified immunity for police officers and its relationship to street protest. Growing up in the civil rights movement, watching the tremendous success through the years, the sacrifice, spending long, terrible days and nights in filthy southern jails, watching my friends be beat in the head with billy clubs, but watching America change because of the protest. I do believe that peaceful protest through nonviolent protesting has its place. And the evidence of that is that we changed America through peaceful protest. But regarding what we've done and what we accomplished, we changed laws in America. The laws in America that dealt with the mobility of people of color, where you had to sit on a bus, where you had to go in the back door, with all of these things that inhibited where you could buy a home or rent an apartment. These were legal problems that existed in America. The civil rights movement changed that. We won those battles. However, in changing the laws, Martin King's debate with my generation was, we may be missing the point regarding the disease in America. The segregated laws in America is an external manifestation of an internal disease called racism. Changing the laws in America does not mean we change the disease in America. It still exists. And evidence of that, if you look at George Floyd, close your eyes. Let's make George Floyd a white man, and let's make the police officers whose knees on his neck a black man. Do you believe what you call that slick bang immunity would apply to that black police officer that if he had killed a white man and this white man was screaming, I cannot breathe, and this black police officer kept his knee on? Do you think what you call acquired immunity would apply to a black police officer? No, it wouldn't. And if you do, you're naive. And you don't understand how deep the problem of racism in America is, and the fact that, yes, we changed the laws in America, but the laws was an external manifestation of the disease of the heart, and that disease affects the mind and the brain of white America. It started in slavery, believing that it is okay to enslave people because of the color of their skin. It has to do with the heart. If you're depressed, I'm sorry, but it is what it is.
No, I want you to be honest. I think the people here want you to be honest. With that in mind, and given, again, your past experiences, do you see any difference in what is happening today, the type of protest and movement today versus what you saw back in the 60s when they were fighting when the civil rights movement was at its height?
Well, first, I'm very positive about the young people who are in the streets eating tear gas and being shot with rubber bullets today. One of the reasons I'm so positive is that before Ralph Abernathy died, when he was dying, he told me that there was a generation coming in America of young white kids who would not see color, would not see sexual orientation. Those kids are here today. Those kids are here today. I look at the Washington, Baltimore, Virginia area. That's an area that's 70% African American. More than 50% of the young people on the streets in Washington are white kids. So when David and I met with the young women who had been arrested in the protest here in Dallas, we were meeting with white kids, Hispanic kids. One was a young white lady who had been arrested and tear gassed. So I'm very positive on the fact that there's a new generation in America. But facing the ugly reality that changing the laws does not change the hearts of America. And the bigot that's in the White House lets us know that we have a deeply, deeply rooted problem in America. That the fact that the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. That only lets you know that there's a disease in this nation. that until we face what we're going to do about this disease, the laws that we change is important and helps to protect us as a people and helps to move us forward. But we have to come to grips with the fact that we got to do something about what's wrong with this white man's heart.
David, as we're thinking about as a country and the hearts and minds of people around us, do you have advice for all of us about, number one, how do we get through this movement and how do we get through this moment?
You know, I think one of the things that's most important, Judge, is for us to understand where we are and what we're dealing with. I think you and I can relate to one issue, and that is, I think you spend about half your time the first year of law school thinking everybody should know this stuff. Some of the things we're learning, everybody should know. And for people like myself who didn't grow up in a family where you had lawyers in the family or access to lawyers, it's hard to get access to that information. Along those lines, I do want to pick up on this theme that we've continued of qualified immunity, because I don't want anyone to get off this call not understanding what it is. And so let me begin by breaking it down this way. There's a difference between paper law and trial law. So when we talk about the law in the news, we talk about the law the way the law is supposed to work. But if the law worked the way it's supposed to work, you'd have far fewer Black and brown people in jail in states like Texas because they were wrongfully convicted in the first place. So I'll give you this example, and it's actually a true story. Years ago, and my mom still brings this up, I kicked a soccer ball through a church window, and it's one of those moments where the minute I heard that glass shatter, I knew I was gonna get it. And when my mom showed up, I told her, well, I didn't mean to do it. And what do you think my mom said? It doesn't matter if you meant to do it or not, you did it. You still broke the window. So if you think about this in terms of qualified immunity, it would be like me looking at my mom and saying, Mom, it's true, I broke the window. But unless you can prove that I was standing here last week when Joey kicked the soccer ball the exact same way and it broke the window the exact same way, you can't hold me responsible for having broken this window. Now, had I done that, I would not be sitting here talking to you today. But as ridiculous as it sounds, that's what the doctrine of qualified immunity says. It says, unless you can clearly prove that the police should have known that their conduct was wrongful, you can't hold them accountable. Let me give you a real case to put this in perspective. There's a case, I think it's a 1984 case out of Los Angeles. A young Black man was pulled over. The police officer got mad at him for not putting his hands over his head quickly enough during the stop. He choked him unconscious. And I'm gonna leave out some more gruesome details about exactly what happened, but the man was choked unconscious. He filed a lawsuit. Lawsuit went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Case was dismissed on qualified immunity, even though in the case it stated that they found out that 16 prior incidents had happened using that same chokehold that resulted in someone dying. And in 12 of those situations, the person who was killed was a young Black man. Despite that history, the court still held the case was being thrown out on qualified immunity because you could not establish there was a clear legal standard the officer should have known about that should have prevented him from engaging in that conduct. That is one problem, qualified immunity. There's another, and remember, qualified immunity applies to civil cases. There's another set of rules that protects police officers in criminal cases. If you notice, most of these videos that have resulted in trials for these officers have resulted in the officers being acquitted. We saw it in multiple cases. The reason why is because in criminal courts, the legal standard is what the officer believes is reasonable. So this would be like me looking at my mom and saying, hey mom, I think the way I kicked the soccer ball was reasonable, despite the fact that I broke the window. And unless she can prove that my belief was not reasonable, I win. Again, had I turned to my mom and said, well, if you can't prove that I didn't think this was reasonable, you really can't hold me accountable for what I did, I would not be sitting here today. And the reason I like these examples is because we know it's nonsense when we think of parents and children, but for some reason we lose all common sense when we think about these issues in a legal context, even though it's the exact same issue. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I'm hoping that others, and we of course will give some time for questions at the end to clarify. I'm going to take one brief moment right now, again, to thank our sponsors. Josh, can you put up our sponsors? Again, our series sponsors, Tillotson Law Firm and the Honorable Carol and Dan Donovan. Our meeting sponsors, Honorable Terry Barker, Dr. Catalina Garcia, and Hamilton Wingo LLP. And our friendship sponsors, Honorable Marcy Helfand and Robert Hook and Scott Perez LLP. David, kind of piggybacking on what you're talking about the laws. So what, if any, laws, aside from qualified immunity or what's on the books, must be changed in order to provide justice to victims of police brutality?
So it's qualified immunity, it's the reasonableness standard, and the last issue that we need to discuss is whether or not individual police departments can be sued for the wrongful conduct of individual police officers. One thing that's happening that's not good for anyone is individual police officers being hung out to dry. And the reason I say that is not because I'm sympathetic with them, but it's because police departments are not being honest with the public about why they're firing some of these officers and distancing themselves from these officers. So for example, when Chauvin was fired for killing George Floyd, the Minneapolis Police Department didn't fire him because they thought that firing him was the right thing to do, so much as they didn't want to be held liable for his conduct. So what they're gonna say is, look, he was a rogue officer off doing his own thing. We didn't train him to do that. We didn't condone him doing that. Therefore, you shouldn't be allowed to sue us because he was not following our policies. In order to sue a police department, you have to be able to show that that officer violated that department's policies. Now, here's a catch. It doesn't have to be an actual policy that they wrote down. And this is the same as a hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. If you know someone's doing something wrong and you let them continue doing that wrong, then you have basically accepted that as one of your policies. So when you have a law of qualified immunity that says you can't sue the individual police officer, and you have this law that says you have to prove he violated a department policy to hold the department responsible, when you combine those two things together, what it means is you never get to question that police officer the same way I'd be able to question any other witness in a legal case. If I could question Chauvin in what's called a deposition, that's just where before you go to court, you get to ask people questions while they're under oath so you can prepare to go to court. If I could sit there and ask Chauvin questions, first question I would ask is, how do you feel about being fired? The police department says you were off doing your own thing and you weren't behaving the way they trained you to behave. You were just a cowboy out doing something you knew you weren't supposed to be doing. He's gonna say, no, I wasn't. We all do that move all the time. That's why none of the other 4 officers stopped me from doing it. We use that move every day. We've choked people unconscious using that move routinely, and the police department knows it, and they didn't do anything about it until I got caught on video and they fired me. Once he says that, then George Floyd's family can sue the Minneapolis Police Department. And no matter what anyone wants to say about dirty, sneaky lawyers or lawsuit, Ted Cruz went on Hannity, I think yesterday, and Ted Cruz argued that citizens in democratically led cities where the mayor refuses DHS from coming in as stormtroopers and brutalizing the citizens, he said that citizens in those cities should be able to sue city leadership. That shows that even people as conservative as Ted Cruz know that lawsuits do lead to social change. Brown v. Board of Education was a legal case. Most of the change we saw come out of the civil rights movement had to do with what actually happened in court. So the ability to take these cases to court is critically important. And we need to stop letting leaders mislead the public on why these laws and these policies need to change.
Reverend Johnson, I'm going to switch back to you as we're talking about these laws. As David mentioned, the civil rights movement, you yourself, again, were a part of this movement. How did you see laws effectuate change, or the changing of laws effectuate change during the civil rights movement?
Well, one of the most precious rights we have is the right to vote. And the vote is a tool and a weapon. the right to vote is one of the most precious rights we have as a people. And of course, the right to vote is a weapon that we can use to defend ourselves and help change America. The right to vote is based on litigation, demonstrations, and litigation. When I first came to Dallas, as an example, I came to Dallas in 1969. Dallas had something called the at-large system. It was a slick form of gerrymandering black and brown people out of ability to elect people to represent, which meant everybody elected in city government, city council people, etc., had to be elected by the whole city. So people living in communities could not elect people to represent them. So we had to go in the federal code and change the at-large system. And we've done that by having great lawyers go in the federal code, file a lawsuit against the city of Dallas, and change the laws to create districts. So if you look at the congressional people that's elected here, everybody is elected from a district. The black people on the Dallas City Council are the Mexican Americans elected from districts. So those districts, people that get elected represent those districts, and the people live in those districts. Those districts exist because of litigation, because of having great lawyers to go into federal court and challenge the system. A part of some of the lawsuits we filed years ago was against the Dallas Police Department, based on the police brutality and the killing of black and brown people, and changing the laws and trying to move forward. You can't separate progress from litigation in terms of the progress that people of color have made in this country has directly been related to litigation, and the right to vote is a part of that. So if you want to really honor John Lewis, vote, register and vote. That's the most dynamic thing you can do to honor the sacrifices of John Lewis, is to vote. It is a weapon that people paid a tremendous sacrifice for us to have. So when you don't vote, that's a direct slap in the face, an insult to people like John Lewis and Joseph Lowery and Martin King and all of the people who gave their lives and who spend their lives fighting for the progress of our people. The vote is stained with the blood of our people. So use that wisely.
Thank you so much, Reverend Johnson. David, I'm going to switch back to you because I feel like, again, this is a heavier topic than a lot of these town halls have been. And a lot of the things that you and Reverend Johnson are saying are disheartening, and I think they have to be said. So with that in mind, with these laws in place, how is it that a victim can seek justice from police brutality?
If you're a victim seeking justice from police brutality, the best thing you can do is contact an attorney and prepare for a fight. It's going to be a long, hard struggle getting these laws changed, but the only way we're going to be able to get them changed is by continuing to fight. So if you're a victim of police brutality, you should reach out to a law firm that specializes in handling those types of cases. We're pretty far and few in between because these cases are really difficult and oftentimes they are thrown out of court. But the only way we're going to make progress is if we continue trying. And Judge, one of the things that we've done here at our law firm, and Reverend Johnson and I work together, by the way, on a lot of our cases. One of the cases we're working together on right now is a case to challenge what are called the anti-rioting laws in the state of Texas. We had protesters arrested on a massive basis here in Dallas, Texas, which is really disheartening because when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, Dallas, Texas ranks high up on the list of cities that have serious problems. Since I've been here in Dallas, and I haven't been here in Dallas that long, about 5 years, we've had Jordan Edwards murdered, we had Botham Jean murdered, we had a Tashiana Jefferson murdered, and that doesn't even say anything about the McKinney Pool incident or the young man, I believe in Irving, who took his science project to school. It was a clock, and the teacher assumed it was a bomb and had him arrested. We've had so many incidents here. It's deeply concerning when the police commit these mass arrests under what we call Texas anti-rioting statute. we remember the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for providing equal rights, but it also included something called an anti-riot provision to crack down on public demonstrations that were leading to change. States like Texas have mimicked those laws. So here in the state of Texas, if you're with a group of 7 or more people and the police believe that you pose a threat to person or property, they can arrest you and everyone who's with you. But I want you to think about what I just said. If you pose a threat, I didn't say that you actually hurt someone or damage something. I didn't say that you threaten to hurt someone or damage something. I said if it is believed that you pose a threat, then the police can arrest you. So if you consider a protest like a Black Lives Matter protest, let's say that Peter and I are out marching with hundreds of people. Reverend Johnson insists that I call him Peter, by the way. I'm not being disrespectful. And so let's say that he and I are out marching with 200 or 300 other people who happen to be marching on the same day. And we're someplace in block number 1, and somebody in block number 3, who we have never even seen before, indicates to the police that they might start trouble. The police use that as pretense for arresting everyone who's out demonstrating. And the reason they do it is because they realize it will intimidate people and force them to go home. And the police know that's the best way for them to go back to business as usual. So I would say if you are a victim of police violence, you should speak with an attorney about moving forward with your case. You should also be prepared to demonstrate publicly what you went through so people can understand it. And so they can actually understand why these laws need to change.
Thanks, David. We are getting, we're hitting about the 15-minute to end mark. So I am going to ask some of the questions that we're getting online. And at this point, I'm going to ask people if they have questions to please put those in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So here is an interesting question that I don't know that either of you may have an answer for. Can we enact policy to both increase police funding and create jobs for American people by creating an arbiter position filled by mental health professionals that are partners for every police officer set out on calls, who have authority over the officers on call and also can help them in situations that are outside their training? I think this also goes to a lot of the discussions about quote unquote defunding the police. Do one of you want to take this question?
Sure. I can speak to that somewhat. And I was a prosecutor for 10 years before I became a civil rights lawyer, and I've worked in other legal contexts also. So I have an understanding from a legal point of view about how this system works. And I'd quote the beginning of the Law and Order. In this country, the people are represented by 2 separate yet equally important groups. I was a member of one of those groups for about 10 years. I do believe that we need to have a way of training police officers to deal with situations with greater sensitivity. We keep asking the wrong question with policing. We keep asking this question, are officers good or bad? And that is the wrong question. The question is, are officers too violent? Do they resort to violence too quickly to resolve situations? And once they resort to violence, do they use more violence than is necessary? That's the question. When it comes to mental health issues, I think that the answer is yes. And the Tony Timpa case is a perfect example. Tony Timpa had mental delays and disabilities. He called the police for help and he ended up dead. Now, the difficulty that I see is it's hard for me to envision a system where you coordinate sending a police officer out to a situation simultaneously with a mental health professional being sent at the same time. I think you'd almost have to have a 1-to-1 ratio of police officers to mental health professionals. I love the idea in theory. It's just hard for me to see how that idea would actually pan out in practice. But this questioner is indicating a bigger issue with reforming policing, and that is no one knows what de-escalation looks like because no one has studied it or really tried to train on it. It's a completely new concept, and it's also a very vague concept. And so we do need to force police departments to be specific in terms of what types of de-escalation training they're providing. And we do also need to force them to be specific in terms of collecting data on how those policies are being applied by the individual police forces and what types of change they're leading to.
Other question that we've gotten, you know, a lot of appreciation to you all and feeling like this is very informative, but what are some suggestions on next steps to better advocate?
That's a great question for you, Peter.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Reverend Johnson, we have a question. Or what are some suggestions on next steps to better advocate for these issues?
Well, there's no shortcuts, no simple solutions, but being organized. There's a role for our churches to play. There were 1,200 Black churches in Dallas. So there's a tremendous role for our churches to play. There's a role for our women to play. So being organized, you can change things by being organized. Now, if you look at, say, the Selma to March or the demonstrations here in Dallas, or the demonstrations in Birmingham, those are mobilizations, being able to mobilize large numbers of people to get involved in actions for change. You can't mobilize unless you're organized. So in order to mobilize, you must be organized. So in order to have the ability to create change, you have to be organized. In order to deliver the vote, you have to be organized and have a goal that everybody agrees with. This is what we want to accomplish, and keeping it as simple as possible so that people can understand it. And even if the grandmother has a third grade education, she understands discrimination and racism. And she understands that there's something ought to be done and that we need to do something about this for our people. So there are no simple steps, there are no easy steps. Also being able to work with everybody, being able to work with people from all of the communities. And, you know, the problems that exist with racism in America, these aren't Black problems, these are American problems. And American citizens must solve these problems. So being able to see the challenge that Native Americans face, the same foot that's on the neck of Mexican Americans, that foot is on our neck too. So being able to work with all communities is important, and understands that we have something in common. Somebody's foot is on our neck. We need to get that man's foot off our neck.
Amen.
And one of the things, Reverend Johnson, and I'll let either of you speak to this, that you both talked about with regard to things that can be done is voting. And I want to give each of you just a minute or so to talk about kind of the issues that have arisen with voting, suppression of the vote here in Dallas and or Texas and or the country as a whole, and how we can help to overcome that and get to the polls.
When I think about voting in this time period, I can't help for one overriding issue that comes to mind, and that is the law does assume that people will follow the law, especially people in positions of power. But we're in a time frame right now where people in positions of power are grossly disregarding the law. Not only are they disregarding the law, but they're disregarding the law in ways that we have never seen before. I cannot think of another time in history of this country where a sitting president sent federal authorities into a local jurisdiction to enforce police policy when the people leading those jurisdictions told him they don't want him doing that. In Portland, the mayor and the governor of Oregon have said, we don't want federal authorities here. And the president has still insisted on sending them in for the purpose of policing. And during the time that we've been on this Zoom conversation, I received an email where the president just announced that he's also sending federal agents into the city of Chicago. I think that this is a trend that we're going to see happen in several different cities. And so, Judge, I can't help but think that when we talk about issues like voting, there are a number of things we're going to have to accept, which is regardless of what impositions are put in place this coming November, we are all going to have to do everything we possibly can to overcome them in any way that we can to make sure that we are able to get to the polls and vote. And we're also living in a time period where we're actually going to have to be better than the authorities who are supposed to be taking care of the rest of us in terms of making that things don't spiral desperately out of control. We're on the verge of that.
You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, if you would, for me, the right to vote is sacred. It has the blood of my friends on it. Andrew Goodman and Michael Shiner, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Paolo Luso, James Reed, Kimberly. These are all people who died in the fight for the right to vote. They are in their graves. Andrew Goodman and Michael Shiner were Jewish kids who came down to Mississippi, I think in 1964, worked with a black kid named Jimmy Lee Jackson in Mississippi. They were murdered. Paolo Luso came to Selma, a white lady from the Detroit community, to help us in Selma. Driving between Selma and Montgomery on Highway 80, the Klan pulled up to her car and shot her in the head and killed her. James was a young white divinity student, came down from Boston to Selma and was beat to death on the streets of Selma. A white mob with axe handles and pipes. These people died during the struggle for the right to vote. The highway that runs between Selma and Montgomery, we call it the Bloody Path because so much blood was shed on that highway directly related to the right to vote. So if you don't vote, not only a disgrace, but it is an insult to people who sacrificed their lives for the right to vote. It is extremely precious to me if you could see what my eyes have seen. The church I grew up in South Louisiana called it Plymouth Rock Baptist Church became known in the Civil Rights Movement as the Freedom Rock Baptist Church. The Louisiana State Police rode their horses into our church and trampled people who wanted to register and vote. If you could see what I've seen, you know how precious this right is.
A couple more questions coming in. Someone asked, where does civil disobedience fit in?
You want both of us, or do you care?
I was directing that toward Reverend Johnson first, but David, you can then pop in.
The only thing that I'll say, because I do think this is a great question for Reverend Johnson, is that if there's one thing I'd like you to remember, I do want you to remember the way qualified immunity works. But if there's something else I want you to remember, it's that we're living at a time where ordinary people like us are making an extraordinary difference. The civil disobedience I associate with the peaceful protests that are going on around the country, they have achieved in a period of weeks what civil rights lawyers have not been able to achieve in years. So I would say from a legal point of view, it plays a critically important role. However, that role will only come to fruition if we continue until we get the types of changes that we are marching for. We can't stop prematurely, which the president tried to do with the executive order that he released, which basically changes nothing at all. We're going to have to keep marching until we get meaningful change.
Reverend Johnson, do you have a comment?
You know, one of the speeches I remember from Dr. King, he talked about somewhere I read was the right to fight for what's right in America. And for me, civil disobedience, go all the way back to the student sit-in movement when I was literally in high school. I met John Lewis when I was in high school. But the student sit-in movement is a great example of civil disobedience. You know, the fact that black students from the Carolinas to Texas, Sunderland, and Houston, straightened up their backs and went into cafes and restaurants and lunch counters and done something very, very, very radical. They took a seat. And in taking a seat, they was really standing up for the best in America. Sitting down at those lunch counters changed America. Nobody thinks about going to a lunch counter and getting a cup of coffee today. And that's because of civil disobedience. It is probably one of the greatest things that you can do in America.
Thank you. I'm gonna end us off with one last question as we're talking about civil disobedience and peaceful protesting, which I think is a great question that we'd all like to, that everyone may have the answer to. Also, what info are individuals required to give if you're peacefully arrested? And does that change when you're dealing with the quote unquote secret feds appearing in places like Portland? David, do you want to hit that one?
I do. When we ask, it's a harder question if you ask, what information are you required to give prior to being arrested? I do want to cover this because I think it's important. There are basically 3 levels of being stopped by a police officer. Level number 1, police officer can walk up to you and talk to you the same way anybody else in the world can walk up to you and start a conversation with you. And you have the right to walk away from that conversation. If they suspect that you're involved in criminal activity, then they have the right to detain you to investigate. I have found in my experience, most police officers are not even aware that that's the law. And they think that they readily have the ability to stop people and question them whenever and however they want to, which does lead into the 3rd point. They need what's called probable cause to arrest you. If you ask me, what's the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause? When I was growing up, I'd tell my mom, I love you. She'd say, I love you back. I'd say, I love you more. She'd say, I love you to the moon and back. These legal standards are about as useful in terms of quantifying their meaning as saying, I love you more, I love you back. And I'm being literal when I say that. You don't have a lot of rights that are gonna prevent you from being arrested. That's just the simple truth. Does the law say there are standards for it? Yes, but police officers violate those standards all the time, which is why we need recourse on the back end when they truly do something wrong beyond arresting someone, like use excessive force or permanently injure someone. We've had people who've been shot in the face with supposedly non-lethal riot gear here in Dallas, and one young man is blind as a result of it. Talked to numerous other people who've been hospitalized as a result. So in terms of what information you're required to give after you're arrested, there's basic information you'll be required to give during the booking process. The bigger issue is whether or not you're required to answer a question that's delivered to you by a police officer after you've been read your rights. The answer is no, you don't have to. And generally speaking, it's not a good idea to unless you've first spoken with a lawyer. And I'm going to wrap this answer up by saying my proof of that is the fact that when a police officer is arrested and accused of committing a crime, in most places, you can't even try to ask them a question until at least 48 or 72 hours after they were arrested and after they've had time to consult with a union attorney. And police officers do that in almost every single case. Breonna Taylor's case is a perfect example. That's not a right that's extended to everyday people when they get in trouble, though. And I think we should see that as a problem, if the people enforcing the laws are treated differently than the rest of us. I do want to close out by saying, though, we've talked about a lot of serious problems. We've talked about a lot of distressing problems, but I want to make it clear the reason Reverend Johnson and I are here talking about these problems is because the glass is half full. It's not half empty. You know, it's always darkest before the dawn, and that's true for this time period we're living through. We're seeing some deeply concerning things happen. We're seeing lots of people being hurt, even killed when they are completely innocent. But we have to keep pushing because we're on the verge of making changes that have been a long time coming. And so I hope everyone out there who's listening will stay strong. I hope that you'll take this talk as sober, but inspirational nonetheless in terms of enacting the types of changes that we all want to see for the generation that's coming behind us. And thanks for having me.
Thank you both. I want to end tonight by reminding everyone that Election Day is a little over 100 days away, and we no longer have straight ticket voting. So please go out and vote for every Democrat from the bottom to the top. And I also, again, want to thank our sponsors. So Josh, can you put that up? Thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks again to our sponsors for making this happen. Reverend Johnson, David, it was wonderful talking to you this afternoon.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
It's good to see you, Rachel.